Welcome, everyone. It's the Thursday edition of Talk Back Now, brought to you this morning by Western States Cat, where they have their location on Reserve Street. Some things you'll need all winter, like deals on batteries, especially in a day like today, and antifreeze. Dig It Excavating, bringing 30 years of excellence to every job. 214-4292 is the number. Selway Armory on Stockyard Road, Montana's premier firearms dealer. Ponderosa Dental, just off Reserve on 3rd. You think of a great smile, think of Ponderosa Dental, proud corporate partner of Grizzly Athletics. Burke Orizati Real Estate. If you'll hit the market for a single-level living, contact Mary Burke Orizati at burkeorizatirealestate.com. And by Big Sky Breakout, Missoula's premier escape room. It's a live interactive game where you and your friends, family, and coworkers have an hour to work as a team to solve puzzles, riddles, find hidden passages, and secret codes to win the game. Okay, we get a chance to try out all of our new stuff here. We have not one, not two, not three, but four fabulous microphones. How would the count do it on Sesame? 1, 2, 3 fabulous microphones. There you go. All right. So, John, good morning.
Hey, good morning,
John
Peter.
King over there. We have Merdad Kia joining us here in studio this morning, and also Professor Paul Haber, who is with the Political Science Department. So, Paul, welcome once again, sir. Good to see you.
Nice to be here.
All right. See, everybody's got their own mic.
Yes.
We don't have to do all this stuff anymore with this.
We have been thinking for a while now that we should have a show exclusively on Latin America, but with a particular emphasis today on Cuba, the Cuban Revolution, the socialism that it introduced, some of the reforms and changes that it introduced not only to Cuba, but also had a long-term impact on Latin America and Latin American societies. So we are truly privileged to have a very distinguished guest, Professor Paul Haber from Department of Political Science at the University of Montana. And we wanted to sort of ask Paul to maybe start with a bit of introduction about what happened in Cuba in 1950s and especially in 1959, the July 26th movement, I believe it was called. And the sort of the brand of socialism that it introduced. But then that's just the beginning for the rest of the discussion.
I just want you to know that my history of what I know about Cuba, I watched The Godfather.
Godfather 2, you mean?
No, Godfather 2, the Godfather series, when everything went to hell in a handbasket, basically, in Cuba. And so with that very crust of the lack of knowledge, so maybe you can fill us in on what actually happened there.
Yes.
Okay, so
He just threw out a script and went every other bullet point.
once upon a time, the Spanish found Latin America, and they made what is today Latin America into their colonies. And so for the next several hundred years, they ran Latin America as their source of material wealth. The Portuguese also found Latin America in what is today Brazil, and there were other European countries that occupied the Caribbean, which of course is where Cuba exists, also 90 miles off the coast of southern Florida. So Cuba was part of this bigger story in Latin America of its relationship with Spain and being used to extract resources from, and of course to evangelize souls in the process. One of the characteristics of Cuba, which remains very important today, is that unlike a number of other countries in Latin America, when the Spanish came, the island was not heavily populated, and the indigenous people that were there were quite quickly killed off. And as Spain determined that Cuba could be a source of sugar for them and turned it into a sugar plantation, which it was not previous to when the Spanish arrived, they imported large numbers of slaves. Many more black slaves from Africa than came to the United States went solely to Cuba. So today, if you go to Cuba, you really notice the African influence there. That is a very big deal. That lots of people that don't know very much about Cuba aren't aware. So race issues are important in Cuba, and in fact, I would argue, have made significant advances that the United States could learn from. So race is a thorny, difficult, complex issue in Cuba, but not without some really rather impressive advances. Cuba is a mix of, from a liberal democratic perspective, of advances that are inspiring to lots of progressives around the world, including in Latin America, inspired much in Latin America. We'll get into more depth about that, and problems from a liberal democratic perspective. I think we all always need to remember from what perspective are we evaluating Cuba, because it makes a lot of difference. There is no clear, easy, objective truth there. So to speed up to 1959, the United States gets involved in 1898 in the so-called Spanish-American War, which was...
Remember the Maine, right?
Remember the Maine,
Right.
where the United States used a rather bogus opportunity to basically break out onto the world scene. And many people date, I think, it's as good as any date and better than most, the United States launch into its global power began in that war. And one of the booties for the United States was to take basic possession of Cuba. Didn't do it literally. Cuba was never literally a colony of the United States, but ran in many ways in a similar fashion. So for right now, in terms of historical sweep, I'll just sweep over that the United States stays very involved from 1898 into the 1950s, including support for a guy named Batista, who was the United States man on the ground in Havana, and had a kind of classic relationship between strong man in Latin America and going along with and cooperating with the United States. That then came to an end as Fidel Castro and his cohorts, his revolutionary comrades, basically fought a long war in Cuba for independence, and then in 1959, January 1959, basically marched into Havana, and that begins the next epoch.
Okay, and we're going to take a break. 721, we've had just a thumbnail history so far, far better than I could do with my godfather.
And no horse heads needed.
I know. We're going to come right back. By the way, we have four microphones. We have 4 phone lines. So if you want to get in on this, we're just.
There's 4 guests.
Amazing.
4 speakers today.
It's amazing today. All right, so much going on. I just wish it was 4 degrees above zero. That would be nice, too. We're going to come right back with more of Talk Back here in just a moment. Stay with us. Yeah, we're back on Talk Back. 721-1290 is our number. We've already gotten some calls coming in. We're going to get to those here in a moment. But we need to lay more of a foundation of what's going on with the history of Cuba. Again, we're privileged to have Paul Haber with us this morning from the Political Science Department, University of Montana. Merdad Kia also joining us. So, Merdad, please continue.
Yeah, so a little bit, Paul, with this wonderful, synopsis that you gave, the historical synopsis, a little bit more about Batista, who he was. But there was also massive investment, especially from the U.S. side, United Fruit, and then there were casinos. There were also the sense that mafia was also investing a great deal in Cuba and so on and so forth. And how did this revolution come about? What was it for and what was it against? Clearly it had an anti-American, or shall we say what they would say, anti-colonial or anti-imperialist sort of component. But how is it rooted in the Cuban history? Is it a new phenomenon, or is it based on previous revolutionary movements that Castro and Che Guevara and others were building.
Okay. That's a lot to try to do a synopsis on all of that. And so what I think I'll try to do is I'll say something rather summary, and we can get more into details of that, because there's just a lot of threads there, a lot of themes. One is, we could talk about Batista for a long, we could talk about him for an hour, and the relationship that he had with the United States. But I think at the beginning, what I'll just say, what I think might be most relevant to the callers, is that Batista had a very long history in Cuba. He was president a couple of times. He had been elected president, and then he imposed himself as president. He was the power behind the presidency at various points in history, comes in and out. He has a 2-3 decade history in Latin America, in Cuba. He was originally a sergeant, which is really rather unusual, that you don't usually get sergeants moving to the head of the line, but he was an unusual character, a very strong personality. And he and his cohort that controlled Cuba for a long period of time cooperated with business interests from the United States that had begun to make their presence known in the Cuban political economy beginning in the 1890s and move forward. Havana was, some people would say notoriously, known throughout the Western Hemisphere as a kind of playground for United States tourists. For a very long number of years, Havana in particular was the sort of hot spot.
Would it be equivalent to like a Las Vegas, like goes there, stays there, you can do
but just
things?
A whole lot funner.
Okay, but like the stuff you wouldn't want to do or get caught doing in the U.S., you would go to Havana.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Cubans know how to party in a way that people in Nevada would only aspire to. The music, the scene, the night scene in Havana to this day is awesome. And it has a long history. They didn't lose that when they lost the Americans. But they did lose an awful lot of revenue. And Merdad brought up the question of the mafia. And, of course, like any playground, adult playground, I don't care if it's Bangkok or whether it's Las Vegas or whether it's Havana.
Organized crime, right?
There will be organized crime. Organized crime has been with us, is with us, and I assure you will be with us into the future. And so that was a very important thing there. And those guys left in 1959 in a hurry. And so one of the concerns is, I think that we might get into it, is how Cubans are going to manage the opening of what's coming next. And they are concerned not to go back to 1959. They do not want that. That's a big deal.
Let's get to the phone. We got our headphones on. Everybody's got your headphones on. Let's get to the phone and say good morning to our friend Catherine. Hi, Catherine. What's on your mind?
Oh, good morning. I'm not sure if you wanted to address this or not, but it seems to me that Venezuela is going through a similar kind of upheaval that Cuba went through back then. Would you kind of talk a little bit about that, because it's the current iteration of a socialist revolution?
I guess I would say that Venezuela shares very little in common with Cuba, almost nothing.
I can't hear you.
I would say that Cuba, the history of Cuba, whether it be the period of time that we've talked about so far, particularly around the Cuban Revolution of 1959, and then the order that was put in place, shares very few similarities with the history of Venezuela, which is very, very, very different. It's a completely different history. I mean, there are some broad themes that are similar, but to say, for example, to talk about problems in socialism, which is a good thing to talk about, it's an interesting, the challenges of socialism, like the challenges of liberal democracy, I guess we could talk about them, but we have to do it carefully. So, for example, if we talk about the challenges of liberal democracy in Great Britain, Germany, France, and the United States, we can do that. But we need to emphasize the differences along with the similarities. And certainly we would want to do that between Venezuela and Cuba.
Okay, anything else, Catherine?
Nope, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks for the
And
call.
there is something also based, building on what Paul just said. So there has been a process of elections in Venezuela. I mean, this is something that was absent. The presence of a massive amount of petroleum, which has brought revenue to Venezuela, which has been absent in the Cuban. I mean, there's a list of factors that one can put right off the bat on the table and see how different the two are in terms.
I mean, one point to sort of pick up on the similarities, because I don't mean to be saying we can't find some interesting comparisons of similarities, would be the importance of strong personalities, of course. Chavez and Fidel Castro and their joint positions vis-a-vis the United States and their critiques of the United States, as well as their fierce nationalist sensibilities that relate to a guy named Simón Bolívar, and who was sort of the George Washington of Latin America, if you will, I mean, very roughly, and their veneration of Simón Bolívar. One of the things I think very important to understand about the Cuban Revolution was that the revolution, and this goes back to something that Merdad had asked earlier, like who were these? Who was the July movement? They were nationalists inspired by nationalist independence thinkers in Latin America. Simón Bolívar, José Martí of Cuba, they were on the map. Karl Marx was nowhere in the beginning. That came later.
Yeah, we got to take a break. We're overdue. We're going to come right back. Again, all four of our lines are open. 721-1290 is our number. 1-800-568-5309. This is Talkback, and we'll be back in a moment. Hey, we are back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We have all four lines open. John King is right over there, and we have Merdad Kia. And go ahead, Merdad.
So, when you were talking about it, Paul, in terms of it started with a very strong nationalistic sense of regaining the independence and sovereignty of your country in terms
Anti-imperial.
of anti-imperial. Exactly. So how do we describe the move from this nationalistic anti-imperialist sort of discourse and movement to a more Marxist, and in fact Marxist-Leninist sort of point of view?
Well, there of people who study Cuba who have something like an independent voice. First of all, the study of Cuba is highly politicized. We won't probably get into that topic in any detail, but if you go to a Latin American Studies Association meeting, which is my large trade bloc, 5,000 Latin Americanists will descend someplace every year, and the Cuba panels are where the fights break out. I mean, sometimes literally. So passions run very high on this. So I just want the listeners to know that. And so what I'm going to say is kind of like a milk toast down the middle of the road. and amongst very knowledgeable, engaged scholars, you get fierce disagreements, them using different kinds of materials and evidence and brought to bear. And it can be quite fascinating. So I guess that down the middle of the road position that I would take is that the United States government, under the Eisenhower administration first, and then the first years of the Kennedy administration, which was different than the last year or two. I mean, the Kennedy administration
before the Bay of Pigs, right? Or before the
well,
crisis.
yeah, but certainly before the Bay of Pigs,
Right.
you saw what I'll just call it. You saw the right wing Kennedy. You
Okay.
saw.
Let's hold it right there. I'm so sorry. We're right at getting into the good stuff, and so we have to take a break.
Sure.
But we have another whole hour to stretch out and talk about this. So.
By the way, if you're one of those Cuban Latin American professionals and you'd like to start a fight on the radio, the phone number is 721-1290.
And we have four lines you can fight over. We're going to come right back. Stay with us. Okay, we are back, and we have a quite literally a room full today. John King is right over there. Good morning, John. I'm Peter Christian. Also joining us is Merdad Kia from the University of Montana Department of History, and from the Political Science Department, Paul Haber. And we're right in the middle of a fascinating, if you will, beginning a history lesson, on Cuba. So let us continue. So
I
where should
wanted
we pick up
to
here?
start with a quotation from President John F. Kennedy, October 24th, 1963.
Okay.
It's very interesting quotation. I believe that there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation, and exploitation were worse than in Cuba. In part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. I approve the proclamation which Fidel Castro made when he justifiably called for justice and especially yearned to rid Cuba of corruption. I will even go further to some extent as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Batista regime, I'm in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. That is perfectly clear. End of quote.
So this is President Kennedy number 2. So both John and Bobby, clearly, Bobby, if you watch his history over time, learned a lot. It's really rather impressive. I can't think, I don't know what you would say, Merdad, but when you think about American presidents, the change between JFK elected and JFK shot was really rather impressive, which raises questions, of course, of who killed him and why was he killed.
Oh, you're getting Peter all riled up.
But the more concrete point, I mean, I don't mean to get into a big thing about who killed JFK myself, but the point was that JFK really changed. Listen to what you just said. That is an impressive statement. One of the listeners may be interested that there was a French journalist that was famously with Fidel when he received news of JFK's assassination, and they were on the beach, and he proceeded to pick up chairs and throw them through windows. He was so upset.
JFK.
Fidel.
Or the French journalist. Oh,
Fidel.
Okay.
Because Fidel had heard that. He
thought he had an ally.
He thought the possibility of a rapprochement between the United States and Cuba was a possibility. I'm fairly sympathetic. I didn't quite. So why did Castro regime become Marxist-Leninist? Because they existed within the United States Cold War backyard. I firmly believe that.
So
were they liberal Democrats that are going to satisfy probably the sensibilities in this room, including my own? No. They were not. They had other agendas in mind. They wanted to redistribute wealth.
Were they uncomfortable bedfellows with the Soviets?
Why would you trade in the United States for the Soviet Union if the United States would accept you on something like your terms? No good reason. The United States market was much bigger. Cuba had a history with the United States. It was much closer. I mean, if you go to Cuba, Cubans have a long-standing relationship with the United States. If you look around the world at countries that were former colonies, including our own, who are we closest to? Great Britain. If you look at the history of countries that were colonized and then decolonized, they tend to have their closest relationship with their former colonizers. For a whole bunch of reasons. They have all kinds of historic ties, cultural ties, political ties,
Language.
economic ties. Right. Cubans love baseball. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And so I would argue forcefully that the problem was that of the United States. I will quote my ex-president.
When you say
he said it well.
When you say that the United States would not accept Cuba on the terms that it wanted, and therefore it kind of went to Soviet Russia, what were the terms that Cuba wanted that the United States rejected?
The United States would no longer be able to determine who was in political office, no longer be able to determine the public policy of the sovereign state of Cuba. In other words, Cubans are Cubans. They make their own decisions. They have sovereignty, and they interact with the United States as a much larger power in the Western Hemisphere, but not dictating their political economy or social relations or culture.
They didn't want to be a puppet government of the United States.
They were going to be independent. There was no ifs, ands, or die trying.
So my question to you is this: that you said it was the backyard of the Cold War that kind of bred this Marxist nature in Cuba. But there are many countries that didn't go full-on Marxist like Cuba or North Korea did in that time period.
Cuba and North Korea should not say in the same breath.
Well, I'm saying them in the same breath. In that there's some of the only socialist governments that have continued to this day, and personally, I think a lot of it is their isolation from the rest of the world has kind of helped them to do that. And they came around in the same time period. I mean, there's some similarities. I'm not saying that they're cross-applicable or anything, but I guess my question for you, though, is this: when it comes to Cuba, why do you think it took on the nature that it did? I mean, so many other South American countries, or Latin American countries even, didn't go as full throttle as Cuba.
What other radical, redistributive countries can you cite for me in the Western Hemisphere during the Cold War?
You mean along with Cuba?
Cuba would be the only one.
Right, yes.
So when you're going to do that, when the United States imposes a trade embargo on you and makes foreign investment in your country illegal, and then teams up all of your allies, the United States, in that trade embargo, what the hell do you do? So you go to the Soviet Union. It was the only other game in town.
So you think America's position basically forced them into Marxism?
Yes.
Okay. Well, with that, we're going to take a break.
And so does JFK.
Okay. So 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. Agree or disagree? You want to join in? This is a fascinating conversation. We very rarely get a chance to talk too much about Cuba, so we're doing that today. So if you have a question or a comment, phone's ringing right now. We're going to come right back after this. Okay, we are working on our technical issues here. We understand that poor Paul is having a hard time being heard, so we switched microphones with him. So let us go ahead and see how you're sounding now, Paul.
How am I sounding now?
Oh my gosh, that's much gooder. All right, let's get to the phones, and Mike is on the line. Mike, you're on with our guests. Hi, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. The historical context of the Cold War has to be a big, huge factor in this because communism was on the march. The Iron Curtain was going up. China was in the throes of their revolution where millions of Chinese were dying. We had to support some really bad characters out there to keep communism at bay. We had to support Batista. We had to support the Shah of Iran. We had to deal with some pretty shady characters. Otherwise, the whole world was going to be engulfed. We were going to be one island of democracy with maybe Great Britain and Western Europe, and that was it. So it was kind of I'm sensing an anti-Americanism with the bogus Spanish-American War. The Maine was just the flash pan. There was a huge controversy about the expansion of the South and so there were a lot of factors when it came to the Spanish-American War. But you got to realize that you can't blame America for all this. We were expanding, and and so was communism, and it was a race. And so when you suggest that America is the cause for the communist revolutions around the world, or at least in Cuba, and
Well, I think to be fair, he wasn't necessarily saying that. He was saying that the Cold War nature. Oh,
Go ahead.
didn't mean to cut him off.
All right, no.
I think that Paul was trying to say that the Cold War struggle is what led to it, and I mean that's a struggle between the Cold War is a big there's multiple different agents in that struggle, but it does shape some of your positions, and maybe what you did is the best course of action for your country, but there's going to be side effects.
And I beg to differ on the question of there was just communism versus some nasty guy who will represent and protect the U.S. interest. I don't want to sort of derail our discussion from Latin America, but you brought up Iran, and the issue is the option was not communism versus the Shah's government. In fact, Iran had a very long tradition of democratic elections, and at the time, when CIA and MI6 joined forces in support of various oil companies, to remain unnamed at this point, and overthrew a democratically elected government, the leader of Iran was what I would actually call a veteran Democrat with a small d. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh had nothing to do with communism. He was actually anti-communist, and actually a striking similarity with Arbenz in Guatemala in some ways. We were actually engineering coups against nationalist governments. In the case of Iran in August of 53, then in the case of Arbenz in 54, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. And even later, let's bring another Latin American case of Salvador Allende. In terms of the Popular Front, yes, they were Marxist and there were elements, but Allende's, sort of project, from what I understand, was not to create a dictatorship of proletariat, in the sort of old Marxist-Leninist sense. It was actually use the democratic process in order to introduce fundamental social and economic changes. So I think it's a little bit black and white kind of situation that has been presented to us. But that's, as always, far more nuanced than one would think in the first place.
Let's get another call on. Let's get Dave. Wait the longest. Dave, you are on with our guests. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, good morning. I have two questions. First question is why does the United States treat communist Cuba different than it treats communist China? And the second question is more nuanced. Could a country by chance be economically a communist country, but also a democratic republic? And I'd be curious to know if that's a possibility.
Okay, thanks, Dave. All right, so
They're good questions.
The answer to why we treat the Cubans different than the Chinese, kind of one of the classic answers to that is Florida and New Jersey. And what I mean by that, and this is an answer that you hear from a lot of people, which is that for a U.S. president to do a rapprochement with the United States, with Cuba, has a political.
you might want to explain that term, please.
A rapprochement would be an improvement in relations.
Come together,
settle the fight,
Gotcha.
and we're going to agree to get along, even though we might not like each other.
I have to ask the dumb questions. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's
my job.
I'm glad that you brought that up.
Go ahead.
So the short answer is that there were political liabilities associated with normalizing relations with Cuba. President Obama obviously made a different calculation. Now we're entering into something that is going on now in Latin America, which is fascinating.
His loss Hillary's loss in Florida might be partially due to that.
It might be, but the reason that President Obama did what he did is there's a couple of reasons there that most people who follow this closely would identify. One is the absurdity of continuing to try to isolate Cuba, because when the United States does that, it isolates itself from the rest of the world. Most importantly, Latin America, where it has lost significant influence that it once had in the past. Latin America writ large is opposed today, not always, but today, to U.S. policy in Cuba, the Cold War policy that persisted after the end of the Cold War. So Obama needed to do that not only to improve relations with Cuba, but to maintain the already weakened relations that it has in Latin America.
So may I ask again, please forgive the dumb question. It sounds to me like your view of America's treatment of Cuba was more like a 50-year temper tantrum more than anything else. Is that right? Where you won't play our way, so we're just going to take our ball and go home. Is that right, or am I wrong?
I guess that is what I'm essentially saying, but I don't want to make light of the Cold War. I mean, the caller, I think, made a good point, right, which I agree with. The Cold War was a very serious conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States for hearts and minds and treasure, geopolitical, security, economic concerns around the world.
Not to mention survival.
No doubt about it. The place that I take exception with one of the previous callers is what I would call American exceptionalism. That somehow the United States are this unusual good guy and doesn't act like other empires, which is just foolish. The United States during the Cold War was competing as hard as it could for hearts and minds. And that meant that in particular instances, it lost nuance. It could not see the difference, for example, between pink and red. Everything was red to U.S. Cold warriors, which is not to say that the Soviet Union, was a nicer country or somehow like a superior imperial master. I mean, ask the East Europeans.
Will you
so
admit
I'm
that
not
it was,
arguing that.
Will you admit that it was a worse country?
In terms of the way that it treated countries and where it intervened?
In almost every way.
Let's get more specific.
Okay. Economically worse, human
Guatemala,
rights worse, freedoms worse,
1954?
liberty worse,
No.
treatment of neighbors worse.
Okay, with that, we're going to hang on, guys. I'm sorry. I got to be the sheriff here. I got to jump in and take a commercial break. Here we go. And we'll talk about this when we come back. Plus, we have Louis on the line who wants to visit as well. And we have 3 other lines open. We'll be right back. We're just what you guys miss during the breaks is really fascinating. I wish we could put it on tape. But anyway, we're sitting here talking about Cuba and Latin America and the relationship with the United States over the years. Merdad Kia joining us, Paul Haber, of course that's John King. I'm Peter Christian, and let's take a quick phone call. So grab your headphones.
Yeah.
Louis has been waiting a long time. I don't like to make our listeners wait too long on the phone. So Louis, you're on Talkback. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. It's been a great conversation with you folks, and I've been learning a lot. I have a very simple question, and it's got to do with what I think President Barack Obama made such a great decision. I mean, just fantastic in opening up, or the beginning of the opening up of relations again with Cuba, and I'm all in favor of that. My question for the folks, and this might be a tough one, is how do you think the newly elected administration is going to handle what Barack Obama did in opening up relations with Cuba? Will it continue, or will it come to a screeching halt? And badee, that's all, folks.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I do know one thing that Trump has said. Maybe you can play off this because I was looking it up this morning. When he was running in a speech in Florida, which I think is important given what we were just talking about the influence of Cuban Floridians in American elections and the power of Florida when it comes to our electoral college. When he was in Florida, President-elect Trump mentioned that he was going to reverse Obama's policy towards Cuba unless Cuba gave in on human rights. I'm sorry, it was political and religious liberties. So those were the two focuses of that statement. So unless he saw freedoms in both politically and religiously in Cuba, he would reverse President Obama's position. At least that's what he said that one time. I'm not sure if he's made other statements contrary, but that's what I was able to find. Most recent statement on Cuba.
And I would put a spin on Louis' excellent question that two of our presidential challengers, contenders, Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, are both Cuban Americans, and they have a very strong opinion and opposition to normalization of the relationship. And how would their voices sort of add to the position of the new President-elect Trump, in terms of developing, designing a new foreign policy toward Cuba? How much do their voices have a say in designing this new policy?
Well, clearly, the Republican Party, writ large, including all the personalities that have been mentioned here, are going to turn a new eye to the arrangement that began under President Obama. Is the Trump administration going to reverse a whole set of decisions, foreign policy decisions, so we could bring Iran back into the conversation? This is a great unknown. People don't know really how serious the Trump administration is going to be in terms of implementing some of the more extreme statements made by candidate Trump and some of the other people in the incoming administration and some of the major players like Merdad just mentioned. We just don't know. Nobody knows. I think it's going to be harder to reverse those things than a lot of people think. Reversing Iran is going to be quite a process, but this going in and renegotiating, I mean, this is an example. I mean, I think you articulated it very well. So Trump is coming in and basically saying, I'm going to get a better deal, and you're going to do what I tell you to do, and you're going to look like I imagine our country to look like, more like that, or we're going to sever relations with you. I guarantee you what the Cubans are going to do. That I can tell you. They have not done what they have done for as long as they've done, only to salute President Trump. It's not going to happen. And he'll hurt relations in the entire Western Hemisphere.
So let me ask you this. It's my understanding there's been very little change since the opening with Cuba as far as freedoms in the country of Cuba. That things have pretty much been par for the course. There hasn't been a big liberalization of freedom or anything like that.
No, you're correct.
So I guess the question for the United States is, what do we want out of Cuba? And I would put that pretty high on the list. The question is, how do you get it?
Well, how about the United States simply believing that it actually has a superior system, that democracy, liberal democratic democracy is contagious, that if you expose an actor to it, a country to it, that it's going to have that kind of contagion effect and let it play out over a number of years.
Canada has those positions. Europe has those positions. They've been trading with Cuba this whole time, or most of this time that America has been against it, and we haven't seen that come to fruition.
Yeah, so I'm not, I actually don't really believe in this contagious effect as much as some people seem to argue it's the case. But my point is stop dictating to Cubans what Cubans do.
But the question, though, is who are we dictating it to? We're not really dictating it to Cubans. We're dictating it to the Castro family, who has enthroned itself over the Cubans.
Well, the hypocrisy of the United States here is just astounding. The United States interacts with a whole series of authoritarian regimes. I mean, it's just ridiculous to continue to pick Cuba out and say, you will liberalize or else. You can't do it. They haven't been able to do it. So let's go back to the failed policy that we did for years. What the hell?
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear most.
Okay, you always got your headphones on. Let's actually we're way past a break. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you to hang on to your phone call, hang on to your comment for a minute. 721-1290 is the number. We still have 3 other lines open. We're going to come right back with more of Talk Back after this quick timeout. This is Talk Back, and we are talking back. 721-1290 is our number. 1-800-568-5309. All right. I promise we'll get to a phone call real quick. Let's do that right now. Mike, you're on with our guests. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my call again. I lost you guys to the mountains, but I'd like to answer Dave's question on whether you can have free elections in a communist society, and absolutely not. The communism is a redistribution of somebody's hard work, redistribution of innovation, of risk-taking. You take away those incentives, which is called profit, you take away those at gunpoint. Most of the time it's at gunpoint. I don't want to give up my kids' college fund. I don't want to give up my retirement plan to somebody else. So it has to be taken by force, and you can't do that in a democracy. You can't do it. And Venezuela is following the same traditions of confiscating turning their companies, their oil companies, into state economies, and you see the repercussions. You see toilet paper, shortages of everything. Nobody wants to invest in a country like that, and it took Cuba 50 years to realize this, and slowly and steadily they're coming to the realization that a free market economy is the way to go, and America is going to provide that for them future. So,
Okay.
thank you.
You think Cuba actually is coming around to that now?
Nope.
Oh.
Anyway,
I haven't seen much signs that it is, but Paul?
I don't know exactly what to respond to.
Okay.
We were talking during the break, though, and this is related to what Mike just said to some degree. Why does United States oppose the Castro regime in Cuba? And, the sort of the way it was presented, that it's pro-Soviet, it's Marxist, and so on and so forth, and it poses maybe even a security threat, being so close to the southern shores of the United States. But what we have not talked about is the possibility that the Castro alternative, or the Castro brand of socialism, might in fact become a model for some other Latin American countries, and become so popular that it becomes a political and economic alternative, and sort of spread like wildfire as a popular and populist, nationalist / Marxist, anti-imperialist sort of alternative. And that's why it had to be defeated. So, Paul, what would you say to that argument?
I think that is a very important point, and is a point that is reinforced when we look at U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War in other countries, where the United States intervened to ensure that a left-of-center government didn't go into power. Just to mention some of the more important cases, would include 1954 Guatemala, 1965 Dominican Republic, where Bosch is overthrown, Allende overthrown in 1973 with the complicit knowledge of the United States, although I would argue not fundamentally because of the United States. Allende had plenty of problems with Cubans. I mean, excuse me, with Chileans. Yeah. But the United States, I think, was the Sandinistas in 1979, intervention of U.S. in El Salvador during the 1980s. This is just some of the bigger cases. There are more cases where the United States was very nervous that if a left-of-center government got into power, that it would pose a security risk, because the Soviet Union would then engage with that country and the Soviet Union, as they had seen happen in Cuba, and that it would have a kind of contagion effect. It was called the domino effect on other countries, which is partly like why the rationale of intervening in Vietnam.
Which has its striking similarities, you just said that, to Southeast Asia. That is, in the case of Vietnam, if Ho Chi Minh won, what will happen then to Cambodia? What will happen to Laos, especially with Pathet Lao in Laos? And kind of this movement of Ho Chi Minh sort of becoming a popular alternative. And you mentioned, I mean, in 70s, here are the Sandinistas, the FLN in El Salvador. You know, they are using the Castro model of guerrilla warfare, armed guerrilla movement, backed by Cuba, and they are finding popular sort of constituency on the ground, especially among peasant farmers who are joining these movements. So, in a way, its victory, its survival even would have caused a sort of anxiety in Washington in terms of becoming a model for economic development, independent of United States or independent of global capitalism in some ways.
And now, with the end of the Cold War, we have governments in Latin America that could not have existed during the Cold War, or at least it seems very unlikely. We've been talking about Venezuela. Imagine Venezuela, Chavez comes to power in 1998, 1999. If that had been 1968 during the Nixon administration, I don't think so. How about what's happening in Bolivia? How about what's happening in Ecuador? There are a number of left-leaning governments there that use a left language that are able to be there now that couldn't have been there before.
And we have Helena on waiting on the line. She's going to. We need to give away a wonderful gift certificate here. We have the folks at Timbers, which, by the way, is the new elegant restaurant inside the Grey Wolf Peak Casino up at the top of Evero Hill, and we have a $50 gift certificate.
That's a pretty sweet package. Usually it's like $25.
Right.
$50.
All right. So the first caller, 721-1290 right now. Oh, there goes. Let's see how fast. You guys are popular. 721-1290 is our number. We're going to give that away to the first caller, and we will be right back and get Helena. Yeah, we have a winner. So thanks for your calls. We do have a winner already. And we are back on Talkback. So, again, we gave away our gift certificate moments ago. Thank you for all your calls. We have Merdad Kia here in the studio, Paul Haber, John King, I'm Peter Christian, and we promised Helena should be up next. Helena, you're on. Go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you. I very much appreciate the history lesson we've been getting this morning. But before the show was over, I wanted to ask a sort of bring up-to-date question. One name we haven't heard mentioned is a name that's very much in the news today, particularly, and that is Vladimir Putin. What is his ideological interest, political interest in Cuba today? I know the Soviet Union was a source of economic support in its day for Cuba, and that much of that was withdrawn with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But what is Russia's interest today, and particularly Putin's personally, in influencing that country?
Okay.
Thank you. I'll wait for the answer offline.
Thanks, Helen. Appreciate that. So, Paul, what do you think?
To the best of my knowledge, about nothing.
Hang on.
And I think it's reflected in the fact that...
Just a minute. Go ahead.
And I think it's reflected in the fact that after Fidel Castro's death, he actually refused to participate in the funeral. Now, that may be a symbolic act, but also reflects the the decreasing level of interest that Russia has in Cuba. I think, from what I have read in terms of Russian understanding of the situation, is it's extra cost with no real concrete benefits. And Putin's focus right now, it's Europe, primarily, and then former Soviet states, which sort of broke away from Soviet Union, and then to the southern belly, which is Middle East, in particular today Syria, and the other bigger anxiety is China. Of course, the challenge, the economic challenge, but also the demographic challenge of China, increasing rapidly in terms of population and economic resources, with Russia being a receding power or retreating power, both demographically and economically. So there's so much on the table for Putin right around the borders of former Soviet Union that Cuba is sort of a faraway sort of concern at this point.
It's kind of a by the way.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union subsidies to the Cuban economy dried up essentially overnight, and then Cuba entered a period during the 1990s that they call, kind of ironically, the special period, which was just an absolutely devastated economy. Calculations are that the GDP dropped by around a third. I mean, it was phenomenal. A very, very difficult time that they have been trying to climb out of.
And the thing that they're relying more and more is actually tourism from European countries and financial support from the so-called social democracies in Europe, rather than going to Russia or China, for that matter.
I would say that it seems that Putin does still have interest in Latin America. There's been a lot of arms trade with Venezuela, for example. I know they had a big public thing about a bunch of tanks, and there's a bunch of surface-to-air missiles floating around Latin America from Putin's Russia recently. And as far as Cuba goes, there was a debt forgiveness. I don't know how much of just a public show that was, but apparently forgiving Cuba of its Cold War era debts to the Soviet Union or Russia. So anyway, that's all I know.
I guess do I have a moment just to stick something? Just one thing that we were talking about during the break that we just hadn't had a chance to say on air is I would just offer the perspective that, as I said before, from a liberal democratic perspective, Cuba is going to disappoint one that holds those kinds of rights and liberties dear, because they do not exist in Cuba, and there are plenty of Cubans that are unhappy about that. Some of them are definitely in prison. So I don't mean to candy coat that for a nanosecond. However, I think it's important for people in the United States to also appreciate that there have been some rather impressive advances and achievements that the Cubans have done, which are known throughout the world. They tend not to be known very well in the United States.
Such as what?
For example, major advances in healthcare and in education, a kind of equality of income, which again, some people in the United States would that be the last thing that they would ever want. But that is actually something that a lot of Cubans hold dear. And if you live in a country, in Latin America, for example, where there are severe inequities of wealth, that looks pretty good from where you're sitting. That the state would actually redistribute wealth in such a way as to increase the social wage of the majority of the population.
Of course, to get that statistic, they have to not calculate the wealth of those incarcerated, which has been completely taken away.
But it's such a knee-jerk thing for Americans to do. If you ever talk about any advance, any positive about Cuba, it's always met with, well, let me just tell you something that you need to remember about what's wrong with Cuba. My point is, be balanced. Look at both sides of the equation and give credit due where credit is earned, and realize that the rest of the world is doing that already, and they're not fools.
Just so hard to give credit to a brutal dictatorship.
I know it's hard. Got to reach.
Okay. So we're going to take a quick break and reach for a 1-minute timeout. So we're going to be right back. That was really bad. Bad segue. Anyway, we're coming right back. We have 2 calls. We'll try to get them both in, Mike and Mark, and we'll get you guys on in just a moment. Okay, we're back. We only have just a few precious minutes left, and we're having a really rich conversation here this morning. A lot of back and forth, and we would love to have you be a part of this. So let's get Mark on the line. Mark, thank you for holding. You're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Over in Europe, the U.S. pays the host country to have their bases over there, Air Force, Army, maybe even Marines. But with the improved relationships with Cuba, if we started paying for Guantanamo, I'll listen off the air. Thank you.
All right. So what? That's always intrigued me. How in the world, in this country that we hate so much, we have this big base called Guantanamo Bay right there in Cuba?
Because it was there before the 1959 revolution, and I assure you, if Fidel and company could have gotten rid of the base, they would have done it.
That's where the fence line and all that.
They could not possibly win a war against the United States by invading the base and kicking the gringos out. They would have loved to have done that.
Okay.
It is a burr in their side.
Okay. All right. So let's get Mike on. Mike, you're on Talkback. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to be real quick. First comment on the equality of economy in Cuba. Yeah, everybody is equally poor. So if that's the kind of society you want to live in, great. On to my question. My question is relates to one of the laws of political science, which is democracies don't go to war with one another. So, I mean, just based on that, if you look at Putin's situation, Russia no longer wants to have a war with the United States. And so that the military advantage of Cuba is no longer relevant. Thanks. If you'd like to comment on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you for your call, Mike.
In terms of Putin's strategy, I think you're completely correct. It is challenging United States and its European allies wherever it can, but to avoid a military confrontation at all costs, because Russia does not have the capability, and I would argue that it never did, in fact. A country which had so much problem for 10 years, suppressing a tribal rebellion in Afghanistan and losing 14,000 of its soldiers and officers, is not the mighty giant that it made itself to look like. Yeah.
Okay, so we have 3.5 minutes left in our program, gentlemen, so on we go. So let me ask you this. Paul Haber, as you look forward to the next 4 years under President Donald Trump, which people are going, some people are still not accepting it, do you have any sort of a crystal ball where you can look in and say, judging from his past comments and his campaign, how our relationship with Cuba will continue because of you have such a good view of what's going on there?
I mean, I think I would begin by saying that I think at this point anybody would be foolish to try to predict what a President Trump is going to do. He has surprised all of us. Some of us are happy about that. Some of us are horrified. And then there's people in between.
Right.
But the idea that we can know what he's going to do, there are some indications that are occurring. He has put together quite a cabinet. And again, that's to the delight of some and to the horror of others. But still, the extent to which he's going to carry through with some of his more radical intentions in terms of particularly reversing things that were done during the Obama administration is, I don't have a crystal ball. I guess I would, if I was going to hazard a guess, I would say it will be less than the rhetoric. But there will be some changes that happen, and then there's going to be plenty of unexpected events. How might a President Trump evolve over a period of time? We've talked a little bit earlier about changes during the Kennedy administration, which were really rather dramatic. I think the potential for a shift, a transition during the Trump years, for better or worse, depending on your perspective, is certainly in the cards.
More important for the future of Cuba is not necessarily Trump's policies, but Raul Castro's. How do you feel the temper of the man? Is he going to just basically keep going the way that Fidel was going, or do you think there will be changes under his reign?
And I wanted to build on John's question. What lies
we have 1 minute.
Beyond Raul Castro in terms of who is there in the succession?
In less than 50 seconds.
Yeah.
One thing that we just weren't able to talk about, and we're not going to be able to get into it now, is those changes that have occurred since Raul took power. There have been some liberalization processes, more in the economy than in politics. There is a very powerful authoritarian state in Cuba, and there is some thawing that is occurring in some sectors of the Cuban population in which people are, speaking out in ways that they haven't done before, particularly like in the blog sphere, for example.
And we're done. We have 10 seconds. Thank you, gentlemen. Merdad, well, thank you so much for being here. Thanks, John. And thanks to all of our callers. You guys have a great day. Try to stay warm out there. Hopefully, we'll all get through this together.